We can start in order of proximity to me. Question for Professor Borg. And this is, what is the difference between action research and teacher research?
Teacher research is the umbrella term. Teacher research is the bigger term that covers all the different types of research that teachers can do in their own context. Action research is one type of teacher research that follows a particular method or methodology. So action research is one type of teacher research.
Anybody else got a contribution to make on that? Very comprehensive. We'll have to be a bit more lengthy in our
I can say more. I can say more if you want me to.
No, that's a good start. Having a brief answer for the first question. Let's go along the line then. Carol Reid, how can we develop storytelling when teachers have never used it before and there aren't many books?
Right, well that's a wonderful question and could be the subject of another 3-day workshop, I think. How can we develop when teachers haven't done it before? I think one of the things, first of all, is for people to become aware of the value of storytelling. And I've been to several sessions at this conference, and my own workshop has been about that. And once we begin to understand how the rich exposure to contextualized language can both engage children emotionally, socially, and cognitively, and also lead to their language development, that already puts us on the right track for using stories in class. I think we then, among us and among any different culture that we're in, we have a huge resource of stories. And even if it's difficult to get hold of picture books, actually well-known Malaysian folk tales, fairy tales, stories that the children are familiar with in their own language, these can all be a rich start to using stories in the classroom. Traditional fairy tales, folk tales, that kind of thing, and that, which also has the added advantage that you're building on what children already know, so that there will be that kind of familiarity from their home experience and the link with the home experience to what's done in school. So, as a short answer.
Thank you very much. Professor Andrew Pollard, it's also about teachers beginning to do things for the first time. The question is, what is the very first advice for teachers who are beginning to explore reflective practice for the first time?
The first advice?
That's what the question said.
I think I'd say be brave and give it a go. I think it does take a little bit of bravery, I guess, to make a kind of step, to gather some evidence about what you're doing. But it's such an interesting thing to do. I think it soon catches up with people, and they do it because it's rewarding and interesting, and it develops a certain momentum. But you do have to make that first step. I guess probably talking to colleagues as well, get a bit of support from other friends and colleagues, maybe in another classroom, that helps too. I think often people do start where there is a sort of reference group, where there is somebody who can provide whether it's a mentor or an example of somebody who you've heard of. Having a bit of social support is important because it's there are sort of, it is risk-taking, and that involves emotions and feeling of security. So you have to remember, one isn't just a professional, one's also a person with feelings. But that means you have to have faith in yourself and give it a go. I think that's my basic proposition.
So be confident.
Sorry?
Be confident that you can do it.
Yeah. Try it out. And not be frightened if it doesn't work out. Try something else. There's no big penalties, after all. It's your classroom. You own that space. It's yours to experiment in and to refine and develop your expertise. And it's a journey that can go on right through your career, but you do have to make a start. It's helpful, immensely helpful, if it's in a supportive environment, if you've got the support of head teachers and other colleagues. But you can do it on your own. As I said, I think the first thing to do is just give it a try, without worrying too much about consequences, and just see how it goes. You can take a little step, and then take a slightly bigger one, and so on.
Thank you. The next question, if you can all consider, and I'll ask Simon Borg to start first of all, but if you can all consider, and I'll come to you. It's linked to the last in a way, because it's about the teacher and the teacher development. The question is, from a teacher, as a teacher, is there any way that I can develop my HOTS, higher order thinking skills? So it's a teacher asking about the development of their own higher order. I think possibly because your work, a lot of the references have been to developing children's higher order thinking skills. I think this teacher's asking about their own.
Okay, so HOTS.
I hadn't heard of it before.
Lie at the heart of reflective practice, in a sense. So the decision to engage in reflective practice is initial evidence that these higher order thinking skills are beginning to emerge. And so the process of being reflective on a regular basis will naturally enhance those skills, because what you're doing is you're thinking about your work in a reasonably systematic way, collecting evidence, interpreting that evidence, doing it collaboratively, of course, further enhances the process, because you're having to confront your own views and articulate your own views with colleagues who may have different views. So there are processes there of justifying what you do, arguing for particular positions, developing rationales. So I think the reflective process in itself is one which lends itself very well to the development of these skills. In fact, by definition, you can't be a productive, reflective practitioner without HOTS.
I agree absolutely completely with everything that Simon says. And I think one of the things that for me has emerged from this conference is seeing the relationships that have built up over the last 18 months or 2 years between mentors and mentees, and how that in itself has naturally led to the development of higher order thinking skills and a whole metacognitive self-awareness among teachers and also among the mentors. You know, it seems to me, and I hope the mentors would agree, that this is definitely a two-way process, not a one-way one. So that's in the kind of relationships that we have, you know, with our colleagues within the context of reflective practice. I think one other way that it's happening very rapidly, certainly in the context in which I work, where increasingly other areas of the curriculum, other content areas of the curriculum are being taught through English. And as teachers increasingly see part of their work not just as teaching language, but also not in Cummins's terms, not just teaching BICS, the basic interactive communicative skills that children need, but also CALP, cognitive and academic language proficiency. And as they are increasingly involved in teaching that themselves, I think there's a washback effect from that, if you like, in terms of their own reading and development as they look at things, for example, how to use graphic organizers in a classroom with children to help them develop skills such as classifying, categorizing, sequencing, all those kind of things, and then increasingly are thinking in those kind of terms and applying it to themselves.
So you're saying the best way to learn something might be to teach it?
Well, I mean, there is absolutely every truth in that, isn't it? I mean, if you can explain something, I mean, who is it who says it? Einstein or someone? If you can explain something to someone else, it actually helps with that process of internalization. And I mean, children who come home from school and have parents who ask them to explain what they learnt today, the actual process of doing that leads to that. So yes, in a sense, yes.
Thank you.
No, I agree with all those things very much. I think we've kind of illustrated and seen through the workshops some of this going on, the higher order thinking skills coming through very, very powerfully. And that's through inquiry and discussion. And I think more reading would be jolly good, of the sort Simon was, and more creating, of the sort that Carol's illustrated as well. And the thing I think would be particularly interesting to try is some more taking stock across the cases. It seems to me we've had lots and lots of illustrations of inquiries in different classrooms, but to try to compare across them and see what they add up to in aggregate, some sort of taking stock, is an interesting development that might be considered one day, because through that you identify patterns, and when you start identifying patterns, you start to see trends and relationships and interrelationships, and it kind of enables you gradually to move towards theorizing issues, and then you come up with conceptual frameworks for interpreting what happens, and indeed for anticipating what happens. Because what's happened is you've moved from working on a particular problem or issue in a case to being able to have a more generalized understanding of educational issues. And I suppose that's a kind of progression of the development of higher order thinking skills in a way. And it takes you to the places where you find all the other teachers around the world have also been, because they're also wondering and worrying away at these big issues. And so you start to be in a position to have a dialogue with them and with your colleagues in the profession from lots and lots of different places. But the starting point is what happens in your particular classroom, and the end point is an understanding of these issues which have significance in many, many, many different settings. So, but I see that's already happening. That's partly what this event has made possible, because you have been able to go from one case study to another case study, and as you reflect on it over time, you may be able to see some of the patterns and learn from that, and gradually develop these more sophisticated theoretical sort of ideas about teaching, from which you can generate new propositions and new practices and new policies for your schools.
So the message that I get for this teacher is that they should get involved with activities that demand creative thinking, problem solving,
yes,
critical thinking, and that will lead to their developing them.
Yeah, the tricky thing is you can't quite escape from this, really. Once you get hooked on being interested in what you do, there's a little bit of a drug there. I mean, it's not really a drug, but it's so interesting and exciting, you tend to do a little bit more of it. And so you're on a process of development. Of course, that might not work out if you have some bad experiences or something, but there is a tendency for this to kind of become almost life-changing, So you should be warned. This is powerful stuff. It's interesting, it's fulfilling, it's professionally worthwhile, it delivers on quality for children and improves standards for the nation. So it's important stuff.
You have been warned. Thank you very much. Again, this is a question for all, and perhaps we can start with Carol Reid. I think it's a question for all, but I think each of your answers might be somewhat different if we sort of conceptualize your ideas as what the question refers to as being about creativity, about teacher research, about reflective teaching, reflective practice. The question is, in your experience, what are the main barriers to implementing your ideas in the field?
I think I would immediately like to refer to the barriers that I had in my talk yesterday. Was it yesterday or the other day? Seems about a week ago, actually. There are lots of real barriers to implementation. Barriers, both internal barriers in ourselves, fear of risk-taking, fear of failure, fear of not getting it right, external barriers to do with institutions that we may work in, that we feel maybe we need to work on their being able to understand why we're doing what we're doing in the particular way we're doing it. And that also includes parents, parent education, and it's something that I've heard mentioned quite a lot, and this is a very important area of our work, because we have to remember that parents have grown up and learnt English in a context and with a methodology that's rather different, perhaps, than the kind of thing that we're advocating. There are also barriers which we perceive as barriers, maybe to do with our classrooms, the size of our classrooms, the physical space we have, the numbers of children. And I think, very importantly, attitudinally, we have to think about the kinds of barriers and constraints that we can do nothing about and the kind of things that we can do something about. So just to give a little example, if you go into a classroom and there are 40 very heavy desks and you want to do, drama activities and moving around, but actually you've only got 45 minutes at a time with those children, maybe you're going to take a pragmatic decision and say, actually, I can't be going in for furniture moving at the beginning and end of every lesson because I'm going to waste 10 minutes of valuable time, plus have behavior problems. So actually, I'm just going to take a deep breath and relax about that problem and live with it. And I'm going to look for strategies and techniques that will enable me to do the kinds of kinesthetic activities I want to do with my children in other ways. So to take a very little example off the top of my head, if you're doing the Hungry Caterpillar that I saw one session about, and you want your children to be beautiful butterflies and you haven't got the space, well, you want to have that kinesthetic association between the word and the meaning and so on. So we get the children to act it out with their hands instead. So I think we have to confront these barriers and think about the problems and the issues, and that leads us in, of course, to the kind of reflective cycle that Andrew was talking about on day one of the conference as well.
Thank you.
So I think the barriers that Carol mentioned in general terms apply to the range of issues we're talking about, whether it's teaching more creatively or doing teacher research or being a reflective practitioner or any other kind of change we want to implement. We come across the same kinds of barriers, or perhaps maybe if we want to be slightly more positive, we can think about them as challenges. to address, because barriers has a certain insurmountable sense to it, doesn't it? A barrier is solid and immovable. If we think of challenges, perhaps they become targets, which we can think of ways around. And it doesn't mean there are always easy ways around them, but I guess optimism is a healthy attitude for us to adopt. Even more optimistically, I guess we could say that without challenges, our work would become somewhat boring. If we think in those terms. When we think about teacher research specifically, I referred to some challenges which relate particularly to reading research yesterday, but if we think about teacher research more generally, there are issues to do with attitudes towards research, which are very often can hold us back. Either our own attitudes, although I don't think that's a problem with the current audience. Perhaps the attitudes of colleagues, the attitudes of administrators in our schools, perhaps. So sometimes they need help in appreciating and understanding what research is, what teacher research is, why it's valuable. So I think there's a very important set of attitudinal challenges there. Another set of challenges for teacher research are to do with developing teachers' own knowledge and skills. And as I mentioned in the workshop, it's good to be motivated to do teacher research, but of course you need to be able to do it to a reasonable standard. In other words, quality is something we need to be concerned about, so that the results we generate provide a reliable basis for decision making. So in addition to the attitudinal challenges, there are questions about how we can support teachers in developing the skills and knowledge they need to do teacher research effectively. And the third one, and this will be the last one I mention, is the perennial one of time, isn't it? Of time, where teachers are constantly being asked to do more and to do things, not just more, but in a new way, in the same amount of time. And of course, we're always very sympathetic to that. And I think each of us here, we're all very sensitive to not expecting teachers to completely change their practices overnight without some provision of the time needed to engage in that process. But as I said, I think it's useful to think of challenges rather than barriers, and to look at the issue with a sense of optimism. And I think that sense of optimism has come across very clearly in the last couple of days.
Well, thank you. I agree with those things. I'll come at it a slightly different way, though, and I want to offer you the barrier that I'd identify, I guess, is when there isn't an alignment between the systems one works in and the practices that one needs to develop. And I suppose the big idea that is being tried in many countries is the notion of being clear about what one's aims are for a national system, and then developing beneath that the policies and then the practices that are consistent with those aims. So you have a high level of coherence in the system as a whole. Sometimes that's called congruence. It's all about the alignment of the different elements of the system. So, for instance, the kind of, let's say the way schools are inspected needs to be consistent with the aims of the system, and reflective practice needs to dovetail into that and be reinforced by it. Similarly, the way schools are accountable needs to be consistent with the aims and with the practices. So this requires leadership from the top, from the ministry, and all the way down through the system in ways that appreciate the needs of learners, and thus the requirements of teachers, and thus the requirements for schools, and thus the requirements for regional organisation, and so on. So the best, most effective school systems have this high level of congruence, which is principled. So they start from learning, and then they invent the system to reinforce the learning. If you go, for instance, to Finland, which performs very, very highly on all these international comparisons, that's what you find, basically. They do understand learning, and therefore they understand teaching, so they configure their schools appropriately, they organize their local government systems appropriately, they provide very good training for their teachers, and it's all based in a principled way on how children learn, and they have the kind of reflective practices and access to knowledge and so forth to help develop that. So to me, the barrier to reflective teaching is if you happen to work in a system that hasn't worked this out yet. It will do over time, but it's very, very important to have an alignment between the various elements of the system. That can make it wonderful to be a reflective teacher because you're working it with the grain and with the flow. Otherwise, it can be more uphill. And so it's up to the leaders of the system at all levels to face these issues and try and get as much alignment and coherence between the different elements of the system. That would be my argument. But that must be done in a principled way. It must start from learning, understanding learning processes. It's not good enough to start just from measuring effectiveness in some way, which sometimes does happen when people with a particular concern for economic efficiency, perhaps, are put in charge of an education system. They tend to view it as a machine, but it's not quite a machine. It starts from the relationship between the teacher and the children. You've got to start from that learning process and develop a system which reinforces the learning process, not just tries to measure it. You can never grow something by measuring it. You have to nurture it. So for me, in the end, the biggest barrier, potentially, is the kind of environment in which one works. And the only way of having a really successful national system is to try and get alignment of these things with the flow going in a way that's true and authentic to the learning process.
Thank you very much to all three of you. The next question is also about a challenge, and one that will be very familiar to the teachers here, and I suspect teachers throughout the world. But it starts off by saying that there seems to be an agreement that teachers should set their own agendas and priorities for professional development. The question is, will they find the time to engage?
This links with what I was saying in the previous comment about time. I didn't know this question was coming, by the way, but it's just a coincidence. Yeah, I think we all acknowledge that it's unrealistic to ask teachers to do more unless there is time available to it. And it's a question of, my experience is that teachers don't expect lots of extra time to engage in new activities. What they do appreciate, though, is an acknowledgement of the fact that they are going to have to make an investment of some extra time. So, and I think it's that acknowledgement that teachers appreciate. In other words, when a head teacher or someone else in the administration says to teachers, look, I know you're working hard, I know you're working on your development, I know this is asking you to put a bit more time into your work, and we appreciate that. And my experience is that that acknowledgement makes a huge difference to teachers. Teachers are willing, when they're committed to their professional development, are willing to put in the extra time, as I'm sure everyone here is doing as part of this project. And so it's not a question of saying, well, we need 20 extra hours, 30 extra hours. My experience is teachers are willing to put in 15 extra hours if the system is willing to give them 5. That's my experience of it. So I think teachers are quite realistic and generous in the way they respond to time constraints. Having said that, it's not realistic to say there is no extra time at all, and we want you to do a lot of extra work. So, this is part of the alignment issue that Andrew's talking about. You know, if we want teachers to engage in professional development, but the system isn't creating space for that, there's a bit of a conflict there between what teachers are being expected to do and what the system allows them to do. And we do go back to system level issues, although with inspired leadership, these are issues that can be tackled at school level. And we know that inspired head teachers can make a huge difference to the organization that they lead. And very often, the head teacher is the key person to get on your side when you're trying to find ways of creating space and time for the initiatives you want to engage in. We saw yesterday as well in my talk when we asked teachers, you know, why don't you read research more often? Why don't you do research more often? Time is always the top of the list. And some people think that's an excuse. Some people say, well, this is it. But I don't see it in that way. I do know that it is a realistic challenge for teachers to keep up the commitment to their profession, to do all the other things they have to do, the teaching, the planning, the assessment, all of this goes on. And in addition to that, we're asking you to put a lot of time and effort into your professional development. So we are sympathetic to the challenges. The issue, I think, can be addressed quite effectively through inspired leadership at the school level, even if it's not more widely recognized at the system level.
Thank you, Ms. Reid.
Yeah, I think this issue, well, relates very squarely to what Andrew raised earlier about congruence. And I think for teachers to feel willing to invest in their own professional development, they need to feel that it is valued and validated and valuable within their context. And then they're willing to do it. But I think if they feel that they're sort of banging their heads against a brick wall and that there isn't any point, and actually they're working in a system that is a machine, if you like, just to get results in an exam, and that there is no valuing, if you like, of their development, then I think there's less willingness. And I think, interestingly enough, this is often not an issue of remuneration or points or anything to do with that. It's to do with the human relationships and the being valued in the context in which you work. And in that sense, I would completely agree with what Simon has said, that inspired leadership or a kind of staff room culture, if you like, where there is that kind of interchange, the kind of professional chat, professional but relaxed chat over coffee, that kind of atmosphere, that there are opportunities to go to conferences, to come to events like this, and of course, increasingly through social media, webinars online, that we can participate in at a distance. These are increasingly within our reach, you know, from the comfort of our own homes, if we are connected. So I think actually, in a way, professional development and developing, you know, what increasingly gets called a PLN, a personal learning network, through using social media tools such as Twitter and Facebook. You know, this is the reality. It is quite amazing sometimes, you know, if you go to a conference and someone is demonstrating how to use Twitter and they put out a message, you know, how do you teach vocabulary to your students? And tons of answers will come flooding in. So actually, you know, increasingly in this century, we do have tools for our professional development at our fingertips, you know, within reach of our computer screens. But we still need to have that context which is going to recognize the benefits of that, if you like, and to value it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and assuming one's got the internet access, of course, which is... yes, indeed. Yeah, okay. But I do agree very much. The key issue seems to me to be whether engaging in reflective practice or any other form of professional development is a kind of extra, or whether it's part of one's core business. And I think for a system that's developing well, and for schools that want to do the best for their children, it's really essential that it is part of the core business. And then the time, it should be part and parcel of what one expects all professionals to do. I think, you may be a bit in the vanguard here, so it probably won't be exactly like that for a while. But I think if the system is going to develop as the blueprint outlines, that's the direction of travel. So I think that's what I'd say. Having said that, though, I wouldn't want to give the impression that it's necessary to do classroom inquiries all the time, and that it's sensible. One would be researching, on a daily basis. I don't really think that is the case. I think one does it to when there's an issue that merits a little inquiry. I use the word problem. When you have a problem or an issue or something that seems to be puzzling you, so you conduct some little study to see if you can get some insight into how you could overcome that problem. And from the insights you accumulate, you gradually develop your judgment and your expertise. And you're able then to make your judgments with rather less evidence. And so you become capable of being a little bit more fleet-footed, and you need less time because you've become more of an expert. Let me give you a little illustration of this. I quite enjoy bird watching, but I'm not very good at remembering the sounds that the birds make, the bird songs. Every now and again I settle down and I try to learn one, and I have to work at it to learn it. And then when I go out for a walk, if I hear that bird singing, I say, I know, that's whatever, and I've got it, and I remember it, and I can use that in the future, and so I'm better able to learn another one. Similarly, the flight patterns change, don't they? Some of them go, and some go, so and if you wander around, I'm sure you do this, you can see birds flying about in the jungle and elsewhere, and you know what they are just because you saw a flash of plumage or the way they moved or something. So your insight has become attuned to it. You've got that knowledge, and you can then apply it in a much freer flowing way. Well, that's not dissimilar really than doing lots of little inquiries, because once you've done them, you've developed some of the insight, some of the understanding, and then you can apply it in a way that doesn't consume as much time. Because what's happened is you have become more expert. And the quality of being an expert is to almost base your judgments on what seems to be intuition. It isn't really just intuition. It's the accumulation of understanding and experience that leads you to a position where you can make the right judgment call seemingly without any effort. And it doesn't take a lot of time. But to get to that place, all the research on expertise shows you need practice. And so you have to go through the learning curve and work with other colleagues and work on your own and develop your understanding. And when you've got to that point, you've got the expertise that will be really quite economical on time and will enable you to deliver a high-quality learning experience for your children.
Thank you. It's very apposite that we're talking about time because we're running out of it rapidly. But Professor Borg, you wanted to come back quickly.
No, it's like that. I was just going to say that that's very true what Andrew is saying, and it's like that Johari window. You reach the state of conscious competence, and then you go into sort of unconscious competence. You just do it because it's at your fingertips.
Thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly to other comments on time. One is the issue of collaboration, which we've talked about a lot at this event. And collaboration can at least partially address issues of time because tasks and activities are shared, and therefore the perceived burden on any one individual is decreased. the other issue that our perceptions of time are influenced by how worthwhile we feel an activity is. So you hear people saying, well, I can't believe that 2 hours have just passed. I was enjoying myself so much. And of course, we've all experienced 10 minutes, which feels like 2 hours. So I think perceptions of time do depend on the value we feel in what we're doing. So if we apply this to professional development, which is productive, which is valuable, which is leading to visible, beneficial changes in the classroom and a positive culture within schools, when you have that kind of atmosphere, then I think the issue of time becomes less of a challenge, less of a problem, because everyone is positively engaged in that and perhaps not even worrying too much about the time they're investing in it because it's fully worthwhile.
Professor Simon Borg, Ms. Carol Reid, Professor Andrew Pollard, thank you very, very much, and can we show our appreciation for their excellent